The two fleets could be seen sitting there in the void of space. The humans on one side with their back to open space. The enemy fleet with their back against the planet itself, using it as a way to stop the humans from using their main weapons. The Empress, looking across at the unbelievably small amount of ships the humans had brought, was so confident in her victory that she demanded that the best food and drinks left on that bulbous decorative thing that she even calls a flagship. Even as slaves went to go get her food and drink, she beat them at every opportunity. Why? Just because she could. It made her feel good. And of course, they made her feel good. As the two fleets sat there, she sent a message out to her own people, to the three remaining factions, that she had, in fact, subdued the humans. They couldn't believe it. Humans were so secretive, so quiet, so withdrawn. How could she do this? She simply stated that her prowess was enough to tempt them. She expected promotions, lands, riches, and of course, more slaves. When she returned, she demanded that they bow to her with their heads all the way on the floor when she returns, as she has done something that they have only dreamed about for the past few decades. Her gloating lasted almost an entire standard hour as she demanded not only tribute, but parades in her honor with all in attendance. This was to be one of the greatest things they have ever done, even more so than bringing the three factions together to take down the entire Muggensloot. Now they have a trifecta, a trinity, a true balance amongst them, so that no one can actually gain more power than the other. Though behind her somewhat pretty words, everyone could hear the overconfidence in her voice, as she believed that with the humans on her side, she would be able to push her faction above all others. The other factions would need to bow their heads at least for a while, but there would never be peace between the three, and they knew it. At least, not true peace. As she was slowly winding down her rant, she was actually interrupted by the hailing from the human fleet. She claimed, my new servants are calling. I will leave the party preparations to the rest of you, but I expect it to be the most flamboyant occasion ever. She expected them to say something, praising her as Her Majesty, her delighted Empress, her gorgeous young lady, any of that nonsense, but for some reason her long-range communications started to go wild and then suddenly went completely dead. She turned to the comms officer, and he was desperately trying to fix everything, so she didn't actually say too much, but instead told them to put the humans on. The Empress was all smiles, seeing the Admiral again as he stood there, stoic as a statue, looking directly into the monitor itself, not blinking, not moving, and for a moment you would think it was nothing more than a picture. The Empress demanded that they surrender now. They do not have the forces to stand against her greatness, against her ships, and they will now become her servants. Be grateful. You are not going to be simply slaves. You don't understand humans, do you? He said. The Empress, still slightly delighted, was thinking perhaps the humans might have a tradition of simply surrendering to those more powerful. If this is the case, perhaps it was simply a fluke when the Queshfart faction invaded and they were pushed back. Maybe this was how it was. Maybe she would be able to get a hold of those shiny, though very, very ugly ships. The Admiral interrupted her thoughts as he continued to talk. Here's a lesson on humans, and don't worry, I'll make this quick. We have rules for a gunfight. The Empress was a little confused as she didn't know what it truly meant, yet she thought she would look through her datapad, and apparently it saw something about using kinetic weapons, which she thought was a joke. Who uses kinetic weapons, especially on land? or talks about them when you're out in space facing fleet against fleet? The Admiral continued. Rule 1, bring a gun. He raised his hand to motion to his ship. Done. Rule 2, bring lots of guns. He motioned around, and with this, the Empress could see that he was motioning towards his entire battle group. Rule 3, bring all your friends that have guns. And with that, the sensors started going absolutely crazy inside the Empress's ship, as many different signals began to come in, and more human vessels blinked in right behind the initial battle group, and as soon as they blinked in, they began to move into position. The Empress was shocked at this move, as she saw the human fleet more than double in just a few moments. Rule 4, don't waste time talking. With that, the comms cut, and on the bridge, all you heard was him yell, Open fire! With that, the main guns couldn't fire, as they would hit the fleet, go right through and strike the planet below, and the planet was full of civilians. Instead, the secondary batteries, those that were based on turrets, began to open up. Ballistic and energy weapons fired simultaneously. Torpedoes and missiles began to rocket out of their tubes. Decoys began to fly out right in front of them, too. Drone swarms began to pile out of their frigates, filling the skies. As this happened, the fleet that had just arrived began to spread out and surround the enemy fleet. There was no escape, and the enemy fleet began to panic. The turreted main guns struck first, finding the front lines, piercing through all the way into the second lines. The ships themselves were struck and either went flying off into the ether as most of their compartments were decompressurized, or they would simply be pierced straight through and explode. The energy weapons would go clean through each of them and into another ship. Though they had their limits, they still cooked through at least 1 or 2 ships at a time. And with this, the movements of the enemy fleet became chaotic as they all desperately tried to get out of the way of the kinetic rounds coming in, many of them smashing into each other, not even realize what was going on. However, it wasn't going to be long before the chaos died down. They started to get their wits about them as even more human ships continued to arrive. It seemed like there was no end to them. Every captain and even the Empress had the same question. How did reinforcements arrive so quickly? And so many. The decoys that started flying through the enemy fleet were extremely heavily armored to make sure they could get within the fleet itself. The heavy armor drew as much fire as possible, everything down to point defense lasers. This was possible because the huge energy signature it put out, along with radar and thermal signatures. It was confusing them how they were still trying to blast at these things and they just wouldn't seem to die unless they were able to get an exact perfect strike. This diversion allowed the torpedoes to get in close. Though armored, they're definitely not indestructible and much larger than the decoys. They would bury themselves deep into an enemy ship before exploding, bursting it open, sending shrapnel all over the fleet. It was absolute pandemonium. In many cases, the torpedoes would simply run into debris. Thankfully, they were armored, unlike missiles, yet they still were only getting about a 50 to 60% success rate. Success is in penetrating, and then kablooey. The missiles, though much more mobile, were not nearly as powerful. They were diving and ducking as the AI on board would simply move them randomly, trying to get out of the way to point defense systems. They were now starting to get a whole bunch more fire as now the decoys had run their course and now all the point defense systems were coming in. What they didn't know is these missiles would suddenly turn and burn and crash into an enemy corvette without any warning. It would move so fast that the point defense systems just couldn't keep up. The turrets and the main gun rounds struck the front lines and the second lines again. The drones were ready to jump in. They jumped in, but it was a random jump as the electromagnetic interference of so many ships was making it impossible to do a precision jump. However, this worked in the humans' favor as it made more of a glorious mess of the enemy's lines as they began to blast at each other in random directions. Their automated defense systems would begin firing at the drones, missing the drones, and hitting their own ships, finding out very quickly a simple truth that friendly fire isn't friendly at all. While the front lines crumbled and the second line was taking a whole bunch of damage, the human fleet began to push into tertiary range. Usually, these weapons are used for taking down meteor showers. They don't have quite the range of the main guns, but they pack a hell of a punch. The dense munitions moved slow, and the beams were set up to be extremely dense, but they lacked the effective range, so they had to get a bit closer. And as they did, these weapons came to bear with disastrous results for the enemy. The enemy themselves responded with their own volleys once they got their head out of their ass. They fired their own ballistic volleys and were absolutely surprised to find that most of them, without getting a direct hit, would simply bounce off the hull. If they actually got penetration, they would find out really quick that it just left the hole. There will be a slight burst of atmosphere from it, but that ship would just smile and keep coming at them. It was like they couldn't figure out how to take them down. The energy weapons used had to focus fire to get full effect. The style of hull design was new to them. They couldn't figure out why their energy weapons wouldn't pierce the hull after about half a second of direct hitting. Usually, the hull would melt as each of these thermal weapons would strike it, but instead, all they did was seem to scorch it. If they were able to actually hit it hard enough with their energy weapons, the thermal expanse and then reduction would cause the armor to simply shatter, at least the outer armor. They looked and they couldn't realize why, but there was more armor underneath. How heavy were these damn ships? Losses mounted as the humans advanced with unwavering efficiency. Inside the bridge, the admirals and captains barely needed to talk. Their crews were very well disciplined and well trained. The fire control was free and clear and was using their weapons with extreme precision. Seemed like mechanical precision. The communications were remaining steady, and thanks to their work, they could coordinate their fire with the other ships. The weapons team kept the autoloaders just humming away, which meant that for every torpedo tube, there was one launch every 21 seconds. That was enough time for the tube to be opened, a torpedo to be loaded, and the tube to be closed and sealed, and of course, fired. Once it cleared the tube, they could seal the outside and again do the whole process over again. Though the human ships were not getting away unscathed, the damage control teams moved in these very thin armored suits. Hull breaches were patched within 2 minutes or less once they knew there was a breach at all. This made the other side think that these ships were organic, as they seemed to just simply seal themselves every time they were struck. The Empress could see that she was in danger as the third line began to disintegrate. 50% of her fleet had already been destroyed as the humans are still advancing. A fleet of almost 1,200 ships that she had under her command was being torn asunder, and she couldn't figure out why. She began to scream and demand for them to fight harder, then looked over as she saw another one of the larger ships explode and asked, "Why aren't the battleships firing?" Without skipping a beat, her comms officer turned to her and said, "Empress, there's none left." She looked closer on the holodisplay and could see that truly all her battleships were gone. And as she watched, the last cruiser exploded in a massive burst. The humans had taken out the biggest threat first, except hers. And as she saw the third line break away, she knew she only had 2 left. She needed to do something to force the humans back. She ordered the main guns to fire. The fire control immediately started screaming, "Ma'am, we'll hit our own." "I don't care." With this, she pulled out a metal whip that seemed like some sort of high tensile cable, whipped it around with 2 of her arms, and slashed the fire control officer, basically cutting him in half as it broke into his carapace and his body slumped over in a mass of goo leaking out of the shell. She then asked if there was anyone else to question her orders. As she did this, the slaves began to cower behind that giant chair she was in to carry her bulbous butt. She demanded the cannons to fire immediately, and it would only take about 10 seconds for the guns to be fully charged. When they were, they fired all at once. The volley streaked across the battlefield and took out about a dozen or two of her own ships. 13 human ships had been struck, disabled, or destroyed. The Empress smiled, or at least her version of a smile. She demanded that they fire again. However, just a moment later, warning signals went across the fire controlman's desk. She screamed, "What?" With that, he yelled back, "Ma'am, the guns, they're being taken offline. We've lost almost half of them already." "What? Why?" With this, no one had a chance to respond, as the ship began to shake violently as it was being perforated by ballistic hits. It began to shake up, down, left, right, center, and just about flipped over and inverted at the same time. This was enough to shake the entire crew out of their seats and almost make the Empress fall out of hers. The artificial gravity was, in her case, thankfully, holding her in place. A second volley struck soon after. At that point, only 10% of the cannons were able to fire, and they did. Another 6 of her friendly units were gone. 1 human ship sunk, though this would be the last time those guns ever fire. When the human ships saw that she would send a volley right through her own forces in a vain attempt to shoot the human fleet, they basically went, "Aw, hell no," and set her as a priority target, and fired every cannon they had. The absolutely bulbous ship was so large that it could just take a whole bunch of hits, most of which were from main gun rounds, that made the ship jerk all the way around. It was almost like a Mexican jumping bean in space, if not a very, very large one. The remains of the enemy fleet saw this, and many of them turned their ships and tried desperately to run. The Admiral could see this on his display and immediately reached over, pressed one button that allowed him to speak to the entire fleet, and simply said, "Who said they could leave?" With that, the human ships began to turn and fire at those trying to run, disabling or destroying all of them as they ran, and the others simply begged for forgiveness. They begged for mercy as they wanted to simply surrender. Once they lost short-range communication with the Empress's ship, they surrendered as they had no more fight left in them, and the guns went silent. As the human fleets moved around, making sure that they were not going to be set up for an ambush or any type of booby trap, another set of signatures arrived. It was clear to see what type of ships they were if you looked close, as there was a certain symbol on each of them. They arrived in mass with a group of support frigates, but these large ships were not warbirds. They simply sent a message, "May we offer our support?" These were the hospital ships. They had come in to save as many lives as possible, and to most sailors out there, these ships were like looking into the eyes of God, as they were the most beautiful things they had ever seen. While the hospital ships did their work, mostly it was the corvettes had to go around to each of the hulks of the enemy ships, along with those lost of human, of course, and started searching for survivors. This was going to be a very long process due to the extremely high number of ships, at least what was left of them, floating in space. Destroyer class and up only helped to rescue humans, as they were very large and not able to move in such a debris field, at least not easy. This was standard practice, as you don't want to risk such a valuable ship. The frigates were sent out to patrol and prepare for planetary invasion. Everyone was a little dismayed that no invasion was going to be happening. On the ground, the planetary government surrendered, And when asked why they were going to surrender without a fight, they simply stated, "This is our way." The humans weren't going to argue. Since the corvettes were still busy, the frigates went to land and found the world absolutely decimated. The population was starving, at least the locals were. As they flew in, they could see several of the cities were used as target practice for orbital bombardment, except for one or two. Large areas, ranging around 120 kilometers and sometimes a little bigger of diameter, was strip mined out of the planet. The world itself looked about as weak as its indigenous personnel did. As the ships landed at the docking bays, the first faction leader who was there wanted to secure his place as the planetary governor. So he made sure he walked, or in his case waddled, up to the first human craft that landed on the ground. As he saw the doors open, he came up dragging two young female slaves behind him on chains, and then bowed in submission to the bipedals that stood before him. He then looked and saw that these bipedals were looking at the slaves. He then offered them, as in a good faith gesture, offering their own personal slaves. The armored bipedal simply walked over and kneeled down to the two that were there, obviously scared and emaciated. He then reached down, put one hand on the side of the collar, one hand on the other side, and with a strange bending of metal, he snapped it clean off. The slave was absolutely petrified, and then the bipedal turned and did the same thing. The planetary governor protested and screamed at the bipedal that this was completely unacceptable. Those slaves must remain in chains and know their place beneath us. We are the stronger species. We are the ones who command them. He stood up as though defiant. Then the bipedal got off his knees, turned towards him, raised the bottom half of his arm, seeming to clench that hand into a fist. The planetary governor didn't understand the motion until a blade shot out from the forearm right into the governor's torso, and then, with a swift motion, raised it straight up, basically splitting the man in half. And with that, all the other armored personnel ran out and did the same thing to all those that were of the three factions. They were brutally efficient, scaring the living crap out of any slave that watched them come through. If they didn't shoot him, they stabbed him. If they didn't stab him, they beat him. If they didn't beat him, they burned him. And by the end of it all, the slaves were still scared. They thought their new masters were horrible. That is until they were brought over to an assembly area and immediately given water and food. During this time, aboard the Empress's flagship, there was a struggle to keep life support running, with that artificial gravity as well, as they tried desperately to get their systems up and running so they could at least make a break for it. They could begin to hear pounding on the bulkheads. They heard this, and many of the command crews tried to speculate that they had just been boarded. That was a shuttle landing. Maybe they're saved. Maybe someone's come to rescue them. They listened close, and they could hear metal stomping around. Then they could hear metal screeching, being slid around, sometimes being thrown. They couldn't hear much else, as they could hear all sorts of slamming. Sometimes doors that seemed like they were having trouble opening suddenly slam open. With this, they realized something was definitely wrong, and they sealed the bridge, locking the doors up tight, locking the blast doors behind it. The bulbous bitch begins to shake, and as she is having trouble getting a hold of herself, she looks over at one of the slaves and smashes it into the ground after raising its head up high. This seemed to calm her nerves, at least for a while. That is, until they heard the knocking. There was suddenly 3 small knocks on the door. This was metal on metal. This couldn't be cargo bouncing around. What was this? Suddenly, they heard a hit on the side. It was like something was trying to break its way in and went to the control panel, but decided to strike it instead. Then there was silence. Then another loud bang. Silence again. The command crew reached around, realized they had no weapons on board. Bam! Another hit. Silence once again as they just sat there behind their consoles. And then a massive boom against the door, and it began to shake. Silence and fear as they all looked at each other, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Another boom hit and the door just partially began to give away. Just a little. Then they saw something. Several small somethings, seemingly getting into the little crack that was there. They could barely see. It was some sort of dark, almost worms coming in. What was that, 4? 8? Hold on, it's 12? It's, what is that? 16 of them. Then, suddenly, the worms seemed to stop, curl, and then the scream of bending metal began to creak from the door. The blast doors began to give away, and everything was horrifyingly suspenseful until the door was quite literally ripped off from where it was, blast door and all. The command crew at this point was about ready to shit themselves as bipedal robots walked in. These bipedals walked in, not waving their weapons around much, and seemed to survey the area. It's though their sensors had to pick up what was going on. One of them eventually looked up to the Empress. The Empress looking down, not saying anything as she didn't understand what she was looking at. And this one walked up to her fat ass, and she tried to stand. The slaves, being broken mentally, immediately tried to help her, but were stopped by the other machines. The slave collars were immediately snapped off with what seemed like mechanical bare hands. The slaves were so in shock they just reached up, grabbed their neck, and realized the collar wasn't there. The chains were gone. What did they do? They simply looked around, completely confused. As they began to remove the slaves, the Empress claims, "Those are my slaves. You cannot take them from me. They are a sign of my authority." The bipedal robot in front of him simply raised its arm, and a 3D image appears from a holographic display. There was the Admiral. It seemed as though he was watching. "I'm going to tell you this once. You have no more authority." And then it simply blinked away. With the same arm that used to have the holographic display, this bipedal thing reached out and grabbed her by her long, fat neck and began to drag her, with the rest of the command crew being dragged by the rest of these robots. The Empress was simply tossed unceremoniously in the cargo bay as she rolled to a stop. The slaves were brought in with extreme care, and they were treated for their injuries, especially the one that just had their face carapace cracked. Then they were given water and food. The Empress began to get back up on her feet and demanded food. There was no response. She slowly was able to get herself onto her multiple bulbous legs, waddles over, and as she approached, the look of fear on the slave's face could be noticed by any species. The machine that was there treating the slave simply stood up as she walked up to him. It turned to face her. "You will not feed slaves in my presence, and you will submit to my authority forever. You will always feed me before slaves. You will allow me to sleep. You will be my servant. Now do as I demand." She stood defiant in front of him. The machine simply raised its right arm to its left shoulder, expanded a little bit past, and then proceeded to show this Empress what a bitch slap is as he racked his hand right across its jowls. The former Empress was thrown back, clearly injured as blood spewed from its mouth, bouncing off of the deck and rolling again to a stop. It looked over, screeching in pain, as it had never experienced any type of abuse ever before. It looked as tears poured down the eyes, holding the side of its face. The machines didn't seem to give a shit. The machines themselves, all standing at this point, seemed to simultaneously move themselves so that they could hold on to the slaves. They also began to hold on to the bulkheads with the other free arm. Those of the command crew didn't understand until the Corvette they were on suddenly accelerated. This made them fly back towards the aft section and slam into the wall, as the bulbous Empress was the last one to land and crush up against them, not quite killing them, but in one case, he might have found that more pleasant. Their command crew was tossed around more and more as the maneuvering thrusters were fired to get around the debris field. They bounced off the port starboard side ventral and dorsal structure as they kept getting thrown around, each of them slamming in, but not enough to kill them, but definitely enough to make it hurt a lot. The Empress was not only throwing up, but she was spitting out blood from all the impact she was taking. The Corvette itself didn't seem to care. Those robots inside holding on to the slaves made sure to hold them tight, but not too tight, to make sure that with every burst of acceleration, they wouldn't get injured, taking very, very good care to make sure they were not hurt. As the Corvette finally cleared the debris field, it was clear where it was going. It was going to the battleship. Of course, it had to. The Admiral was waiting.